For 37 years, I never once sat still long enough to ask myself if I was happy. And by the time I did, I was standing alone in a kitchen that smelled like coffee I had forgotten to drink, wondering who on earth I had become. My name is Harold Sutton. I am 81 years old. And I want to tell you about the morning everything stopped, and why that silence terrified me more than anything I had ever faced in my working life. I was born in 1943 in a small town in rural Ohio where the men worked and the women kept the home, and nobody talked very much about feelings because feelings were considered, at best, a distraction. My father was a good man. I want to be clear about that. He was a good man who believed that the highest thing a person could offer his family was provision. A full refrigerator, reliable transportation, a house that didn't leak when it rained. And I absorbed that belief the way a child absorbs everything, completely, without question, the way you absorb the language spoken around you before you even know what language is. So when I graduated high school in 1961 and took a job at a manufacturing firm in Columbus, I carried that belief with me like a stone in my chest. I worked hard. I worked constantly. I got promoted. Then I got promoted again. I married a woman named Ruth in 1967, and she was patient and warm, and she laughed at things I said, even when they weren't particularly funny, and I loved her. I want you to know I loved her. But I showed her that love almost entirely by working, by being dependable, by coming home with money and security and a kind of relentless forward motion that I genuinely believed was the same thing as devotion. Ruth used to say, jokingly, that I was in love with my calendar. She said it with a smile, so I laughed. I thought she was teasing me. I didn't understand for a very long time that she was also telling me something true. By the mid-1970s, I was managing a department of 42 people. I was traveling 3 weeks out of every month. My son Daniel was 7, and my daughter Carol was 4, and they were being raised by a woman who deserved a partner and instead had something closer to a guest who showed up on weekends with gifts and apologies. I told myself I was doing it for them. I was building something. I was securing their future. And there was truth in that. But there was also something else underneath it, something I wouldn't understand until decades later, which is that staying busy had become the most effective way I knew to never be fully present with anyone, including myself. You see, when you are busy, genuinely consumed by schedules and deadlines and targets and responsibilities, you never have to sit with the quiet. And the quiet I was afraid of. I didn't know I was afraid of it. I wouldn't have described myself as someone who was running from anything. I would have said I was running toward something, toward success, toward stability, toward the future. But I have lived long enough now to know that those two things, running toward and running away, can feel absolutely identical from the inside. The years moved the way years do when you're not watching them carefully. They moved quickly and quietly and without ceremony. Daniel grew up and became a software engineer in Seattle. Carol married a man named Tom and moved to North Carolina. Ruth and I found ourselves alone in the house on Whitfield Avenue, which was a very good house in a very good neighborhood, but which had the peculiar quality of being extremely quiet in a way I had never noticed before because I was never home long enough to notice it. I retired in 2007. I was 64 years old, and the firm had a small party for me, and there were handshakes and a cake and a gift card to a restaurant Ruth and I never ended up going to. And then I drove home, and I walked into that kitchen, and I poured myself a cup of coffee, and I stood there. And the silence came for me. I am not a man given to dramatics. I was an engineer by training and a manager by profession, and I have always been more comfortable with facts than with feelings. But I will tell you honestly that what happened in that kitchen in the weeks after my retirement was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. I did not know what to do with myself. I did not know who I was outside of work. I had been Harold Sutton, department head, Harold Sutton who had meetings to get to, Harold Sutton whose presence was required and whose time was valuable. And suddenly I was just Harold, just a man in a kitchen, and I did not know that man at all. Ruth watched this happen to me with a kind of quiet understanding that I think only a woman who has spent 40 years observing her husband can have. She didn't mock me. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she would have been entitled to. She just made sure there was coffee in the pot, and she went about her days, and she left the door open for me to find my way. The first real conversation I had with her, I mean the first real one, where I wasn't performing competence or optimism, where I wasn't managing the interaction the way I had managed every meeting for 37 years, happened about 6 months after I retired. We were sitting on the back porch in October, and the leaves were doing what leaves do in Ohio in October, and I said something I had never said to her in all our years together. I said, "I don't know who I am when I'm not working." And she looked at me in a way that was not unkind, and she said, "I know, Harold. I've been waiting for you to figure that out." She had been waiting. 40 years. She had loved a man who was always leaving, even when he was in the room, and she had waited. I don't know what that says about her patience, or my blindness, or the particular tragedy of two people who love each other failing to actually reach each other for decades. But sitting there on that porch in October, I felt the weight of all that lost time the way you feel a cold wind. Not dramatically, not as a collapse, but as a slow and certain recognition. Something had passed that could not be retrieved. And here is what I want to tell you, because this is the part that matters. What came after that recognition was not despair. It was something stranger and in some ways more valuable. It was the beginning of an actual life. Ruth and I started having breakfast together in a way we never had before. Not rushed breakfasts. Breakfast where we sat at the table and talked about things that had nothing to do with schedules or logistics. She told me about books she was reading. I told her about things I had been thinking about in the morning before I got up. We started taking walks in the evening, slow walks, the kind I would have considered a waste of time in my working years. And on those walks, she would sometimes take my arm, and I would feel something I can only describe as arrival. As if I had been traveling a very long distance and had finally, at 64 years old, come home. I got to know my children in those years in a way I hadn't when they were growing up. Daniel came to visit more. We started talking on the phone, not about practical things, but about his life, his thoughts, what he was afraid of, what he hoped for. I found out my son was a person I genuinely liked. That sounds like a strange thing for a father to say, but I think many fathers of my generation would understand it. We provided for our children. We did not always know them, and there was grief in discovering that, but there was also the extraordinary gift of the knowing itself, even if it came late. I lost Ruth in 2019. She passed in March, quietly, the way she had done most things. And I will not spend much time on that loss here, because some things are too large to be made into a story. But I will tell you this: I am grateful, with a completeness I cannot fully put into words, that I had those 12 years with her. The years after the calendar stopped ruling my life. The years when I was finally still enough to love her the way she had always deserved. I am 81 years old now. I live in the same house on Whitfield Avenue. The mornings are quiet, and I have learned to sit in that quiet without fear. I drink my coffee slowly, and sometimes I sit on the back porch and watch the yard, and I think about all the mornings I rushed through without noticing them. All the ordinary days I treated as obstacles between me and some future moment of completion that never actually arrived. I am not telling you this so that you will feel sorry for me. I had a good life, even with its gaps and its absences and its years of misguided motion. I am telling you this because you are almost certainly, at this very moment, in the middle of your own version of what I lived through. You are probably busy. You are probably valuable to people and needed by systems and scheduled through next month. And none of that is wrong. Providing for your family is not wrong. Working hard is not wrong. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it, truly sit with it. Do you know the person sitting next to you? Not their schedule, not their needs, not their role in your life, but the actual person inside all of that. And do they know you? The quiet parts of you, the uncertain parts, the parts you keep moving fast enough to avoid. Because here is what I know at 81 that I did not know at 44 or 57 or even 63. The busyness was never the point. It was always the people. It was always the ordinary morning, the cup of coffee going cold, the walk in October, the hand on your arm. The life was always in the spaces between the work, and I spent most of mine moving too fast to feel them. I hope you don't.